The victories of Christ are simultaneously victories we can understand and are also something that flies right in the face of what we consider to be victory. And that sounds a little bit like a weird statement, but it's something that I believe this passage from Hebrews kind of perfectly sort of summarizes up. And I want to look a little bit closer at that with you all today. So we have this passage describing the post resurrection Jesus, the role that Jesus has, which Hebrews has been going into as our high priest, as the one who advocates for us before God, who connects us with God. And it goes into the description of how he is kind of in this position where he is, being brought into the presence of God in a way that the normal high priest wouldn't have been able to do. The normal high priest going into the temple and into where the Ark of the Covenant was or would have been, that was symbolic of going in and being in the presence of God, and oftentimes somewhat literally going in and being in the presence of God. But it is kind of an imitation of the real sort of, encountering of the presence of God that is found within heaven. And that's what Hebrews is talking about. And that in and of itself is a victory of Jesus that we can think of. And we get this also the second victory that goes even beyond that Jesus is coming back again to save all of us from sin, to save all of us from death, and to bring us into this kingdom of His, to bring this kingdom of His to earth and a new heaven that will kind of flow out of that. And these are all victories that we can understand. But at the very core of this, at the very core of what has put Jesus in this place, is the fact that He died. And that is something that, in our mind often is not seen as a victory. It is something that when we kind of consider it, we look at that as being, potentially a defeat. When you think in battle, someone who dies in battle has been defeated is kind of the way that we sort of often think of it. But in this case, it's Jesus's own death on the cross, this humiliating sort of, execution that brings about all these victories that are described here in Hebrews. The victories of Christ, in many ways, are different, are like fly in the face of what we would sort of think of as victory, because the way it is achieved is not by something we generally associate with it. But what that means for us is so much more. Because Jesus died on the cross, because He took the sins of the world and was that holy sacrifice, as this passage explains, this brings us back into connection with God. It makes it so that we no longer have to go through the process of performing these sacrifices to God in order to cover our own sins, to do that kind of yearly process that priests would do around the time of Jesus to cover the sins of the entirety of Israel, so that God, so God would not have to pass judgment on them in that sort of moment. That is not something that we have to confront anymore, because Jesus' sacrifice was big enough to handle all of that. And that is something that we should be thankful for, because that is what has brought us back into relationship with God. And it's through that we are able to ourselves to go and actually be in the presence of God. We are no longer separated out in the way that the Jews of Jesus's time would have been when it came to kind of their sort of own relationships with God, because they were not allowed to go into kind of that holiest sort of place where God's presence was said to dwell. So that is something that I think we all need to kind of rest assured in, that Christ's victories for us have opened the way for us to connect with God in a way that we have not been able to do so throughout history. And through that connection, we do get the salvation that we all need in our lives. Amen. And now I'd like to invite you all to join me for our last worship song today.